Hello, Dennis Madden here, and welcome to another edition of Gears Overdrive. This video accompanies the October-November 2024 edition of Gears and an article entitled Harsh Realities. And what we cover in this is the 7 factors that control shift feel. And I'd like to share my screen and illustrate these. Okay, the first one is line pressure. Now, this is pretty simple and straightforward to understand. The higher the line pressure, the firmer the shift. And so one of the things you'll want to do if you have a soft shift or a harsh shift complaint is get a pressure gauge on it so you can understand if line pressure is normal. That's the first place to start. Now, I have a little tip for you, and that is if you want to really get good at checking transmissions with a pressure gauge, put them on as many vehicles as you can. And what I'm talking about here is vehicles that work. Get used to understanding what normal looks like. And then it becomes very obvious and clear when you have a line pressure malady that you're dealing with that, because the gauge will behave entirely differently. Flow rate. The faster the oil moves, the firmer the shift. Now, this is usually accomplished by an orifice in a separator plate. And you'll recall in valve body kits, they'll often have you drill out holes in the plates, and that allows the oil to flow through the orifice faster. And the result of that is you get a firmer shift. So flow rate, the faster the oil moves, the firmer the shift. Accumulator rate. The slower the accumulator strokes, the firmer the shift. Now I want to take a moment and go through this. This is a little complex in a way, and that is it's often thought that the firmer the accumulator spring is, the firmer the shift, but that's not so. It could be firmer or stronger, I should say, a stronger spring or a weaker spring that will give you a firmer shift, and vice versa. So let's take a look at that in greater detail. I have some illustrations that will show this. Now, this is a 4L60E, and in this example, we've taken off from a stop where, at about 90 pounds, it's medium throttle. We're in first gear. You can see there's no oil at the servo. But notice over here, it's illustrated with green. This green oil here is back pressure oil to both of the accumulators, the 1-2 and the 3-4. And it's controlled by the torque signal. So what that means is the heavier step on the gas and the greater the torque signal, this is from the pressure control solenoid, the more pressure goes into the backspace of those two accumulators. Let's take a look at what happens next. Now, the 1-2 shift valve is stroked and the oil is flowing. It seats the number 8 check ball and flows through this orifice labeled 16. That was what I was talking about earlier, where you'll have an orifice that you might drill out in a valve body kit to give you a firmer shift in any number of gears. It could be the 1-2 like you see here, or the 2-3, but that's what that means. Now, the oil is flowing and flowing, and it heads over to the accumulator and also to the servo. So the servo begins to stroke, and the accumulator piston begins to stroke. And what you'll see, if you were able to tap into this pressure source, you'd see pressure rise up to about 25, maybe 30, depending on other constraints, what the accumulator valve was doing and the tension of the spring. And as the accumulator compresses the spring and continues to move, you'll notice this pressure begin to rise. The servo, when it makes contact and gets rid of all the play and is now starting to tighten the band, it'll also cause this. So during the shift, you'll see the pressure rise up 30, 40, 50 pounds, and then somewhere it's going to shift. And that's very important. It's critical that it shift during this process. Unfortunately, that's not always the case. In this example, now you're going to have to work with me here on this because this illustration doesn't show it as well as I'd like. But imagine that this piston has traveled to the end of its route here, as far as it can go, and it's stopped moving. What you'd have is all of a sudden the oil that was being diverted into the accumulator, well, it can't go there any further. So all of the oil flow is going to go into the servo. And if you were able to monitor that, you'd see a pressure spike. It may have been 50 pounds or anywhere in this range. All of a sudden, the accumulator bottoms out and poof, it goes right up to equal line pressure. Yet now you'll never notice that because in our example, the shift already occurred. And sometime after the shift, that spike took place, which, by the way, always occurs. You'll always get this pressure spike. The secret, though, is that the shift is completed by the time that occurs. Now, imagine that for some reason, either you have a broken accumulator spring or there's low line pressure or the accumulator valve is stuck. So this accumulator pressure is really low. And whatever the condition is, the servo or clutch, depending on what you're working on, is unable to complete the shift by the time the accumulator bottoms out. What happens then is when this pressure spike occurs, you'll feel it because now, in our case, the servo will slam on, it'll shift into second gear, and the sensation that you feel driving the car is of a harsh shift. So you want to be very careful to determine or distinguish, I should say, between a slide bump and a harsh shift. And a lot of times the things that someone may do to soften a shift because they've misdiagnosed it will actually make the condition worse. So be very careful with that. One last illustration, and that is on some 4L60Es, this accumulator system was modified, and we don't need to go into the reasons for that here. And so to accommodate the changes in this system, they flipped the accumulator upside down. So now the springs went into the housing first, and then the piston. In this case, the springs are relaxing during the shift. And because of that, if you were to weaken the spring or take one of these springs out, you'd get a firmer shift. And so the position of the springs, the lineup, is the key to answering the question, do you go firmer or weaker with those springs? If you're compressing the springs during the shift, stronger makes it firmer. If you're relaxing the springs, weaker makes it firmer. Now, those were calibration matters that we discussed. Now let's get into some building problems, something that could happen during the rebuild. Cushion springs and wave plates. It's really a factor of time. So the cushion spring adds a little more time to what it takes for the piston or the servo to complete the shift. And so you could have a cushion spring that was left out, or a wave plate that's upside down, or any number of rebuild errors. In the old days, some transmissions had cone steels, and if you replace them with flat steels, you get a harsher shift. So these are rebuild, or this is a rebuild error, as well as steel drum and drum surface. All right, this one here, the smoother the surface, the firmer the shift. So during a rebuild, you may be under the idea that it's a good practice to sand your steel plates or the drum surface with some fine emery cloth. And I did the same thing as a young rebuilder until I realized that I was building into the unit some shift problems. Generally, a softer shift or even a slide bump was the result of that. In fact, I spoke with an engineer at a friction plate manufacturing plant, and he said you can never have a steel plate or a drum surface too smooth. And you'll see this with choline steels or micro finish where they're very, very smooth. And so the lesson that he was saying with this is the best choice was to replace the steels, and second to that was to just leave them alone. So these two items you can get into trouble from building practices. The next two are related to parts. So friction plate composition. Now, I don't want to get into this too deeply. As a matter of fact, I have an article in the December issue called Friction Dynamics, where I'll talk about this quite a bit more. But for our purpose, you can have a soft shift or a flare or a harsh shift or any number of shifting complaints because of the friction plates that you're using in the unit. They're just incompatible with that transmission. And that goes hand in hand with the type of fluid. So you could have the right plates, but fluid that isn't appropriate for that transmission. So I like to categorize these as parts problems. So you had earlier the calibration controls, things that you could do during the rebuild. Those are items 4 and 5. And then parts that you're purchasing, either the plates are not compatible or using the wrong fluid can cause a harsh shift or any number of undesirable shift feel complaints. Okay, well, that's it for Shift Feel. This is Dennis Madden. It was my pleasure to talk about these items, and I'll see you in another episode of Gears Overdrive. Thank you.